This is PowerPoint presentation 2.1 on the rise of progressivism in the early 20th century. To begin with, we want to kind of recap from Epoch 1 what's been going on that led to the development of progressivism in the first place. What we finished off with in the last lecture was the kind of climax of Epoch 1, which was the economic depression of 1893, from which the United States is actually not going to recover, at least not fully, although it's going to be masked by several different things, some of which we'll talk about. But as a result of this was kind of what happened as a result of the Depression, as a result of these other forces, is there was a general grassroots reaction against the conservative regime that was the United States. And what we mean by regime isn't what you typically think of regime. In political science, when we think of a regime, we think of, or even in the sciences in general, we think of a dominant pattern of thought. Well, conservatism dominated the United States during this period, as we talked about in the last epoch. And so as a reaction to this, the Depression of 1893 kind of demonstrated in a populist sort of way the failure of conservatism. And so you'll have the rise of progressivism. And we see here in this slide some of the difficulties that and we detailed these in the previous epoch. We have the difficulties with the agricultural sector, the business concentration, the rise of manufacturing, the rise of the labor movement, and then finally that banking crisis we talked about last time. The political trends that go along with those economic trends are, we have rampant corruption throughout the system. This begins with Ulysses S. Grant right after the Civil War, not quite after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, I guess I would say. You have partisan gridlock, which is not dissimilar to what we have today. Partisan gridlock is something from which the United States suffers, and if we were to expand that to a more general discussion of political science, we would come to the conclusion that a two-party political system has a tendency to suffer from partisan gridlock. Multi-party systems don't face the same difficulties. They sometimes get into a gridlock situation, but not nearly as much as two parties, because with two parties, rather than multiple parties, you have more of a concentration of political forces. And as a result of that concentration, you have a greater tendency for polarization. That's what we see currently in the United States. We have Obama and the Democrats on the one side and the Republicans, Boehner and the Republicans on the other side. And these two sides have polarized so that they can't get along on anything. In many ways, progressivism is going to be a reaction to this, because we have the same situation developing at the end of the 19th century. In addition to that, you have, throughout this period, and contributing to that last problem of gridlock, ineffective presidencies, which we've discussed previously. Finally, early developments of progressivism, and this was, in a sense, yes, to attempt to alleviate the situation, but also it was designed to kind of placate this populist progressive trend that started to develop in the 1880s. We have the Pendleton Civil Service Act in 1883, and that was largely actually as a result, a reaction to the assassination of James Garfield. As we know, James Garfield was assassinated by a disgruntled office seeker, someone that wanted a position that didn't get it. And so the Pendleton Civil Service Act, as we discussed previously, will institute what now exists, the civil service exam, so that it's not entirely based on nepotism. It's based actually on job performance and aptitude at the job. In 1890, we had the development of the Sherman Antitrust Act, pursuant to and in conjunction with the Interstate Commerce Act and Commission. This was as a reaction to the conglomeration of big business, not so much the growth of manufacturing, but the conglomeration of big business. Will have the formation of U.S. Steel 11 years later. And as I mentioned previously in the discussion of organized labor, the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Interstate Commerce Act were originally intended to serve as a block to the development of organized labor, labor unions being themselves a type of horizontal monopolistic control of a market. Okay? Nonetheless, they represent a progressive trend. They will, however, be generally insufficient. Now we have the rise of Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is famous for two things. Okay? We'll start out with a real simple thing. He's famous for two things. He's famous for his progressive approach to the presidency. Okay? Among other things, creating a more effective executive branch in his battles with Congress. And two, he's famous for his conservationism. He is, after all, the one who initiates the national parks. He creates the national parks, separates them away so that they can no longer be developed. McKinley is assassinated in September of 1901. We see the reestablishment of presidential activism. And the interesting thing is that Roosevelt rises up along with the Socialist Party. Now, inherent in Roosevelt's administration, actually, Roosevelt is a Republican, officially. Okay? Inherent, however, in Roosevelt's administration is going to be the demise of the early 20th century Republican Party. And I know you're saying, why, Messer Hote? Why would this be the demise of the Republican Party when they seem to have captured the presidency? It's how they captured the presidency. Remember, progressivism is rising. This populist movement is rising in the 1890s. Both political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, attempt to co-opt this movement. Okay? The Republicans succeed. The Republicans, under Theodore Roosevelt, add into their party platform a lot of the progressives, the populists' agenda. As a result, the progressives move over to the Republicans. This creates a problem inherent with the Republicans. Okay, it's underneath the surface. It's an insidious problem, which is that you now have within the Republican Party a division of two sides. You have the old traditional conservative Republicans, okay, and then you have the progressive Republicans. This is ultimately what's going to cost Theodore Roosevelt the presidency, or be one of the factors that cost him the presidency. And then later, it will serve to make William Howard Taft, who was our fattest president, which I'll mention again, a one-term president. First progressive movement that we see from Theodore Roosevelt is the 1902 intervention in the coal strike. And we see here, if you look through there, this is the first national government intervention in favor of labor unions. He does not, unlike his predecessors, he does not crush the labor union. He seizes control of the mines. Why does he seize control of the mines? Because coal mining is, at this point in history, the #1 source of energy in the United States. It is therefore deemed to be in the national security interests for the coal mines to continue to operate. And under national labor law, the government is allowed to step in and take control. I remember back, this is back in the late 80s. The Teamsters went out on strike in Florida, and the governor called out the National Guard. This is in the 1980s. Called out the National Guard and took control over the Teamsters that were driving petroleum products, gasoline, natural gas, to market, because it was deemed as being in the national interest. Same idea. Now, he'll mediate, and as a result, they'll get a 10% wage increase and a reduction to a 9-hour workday, both of which serve labor. Okay, labor from Theodore Roosevelt on, labor is going to have a kind of a sunshiny day up until the 1920s. They're going to continue to rise up until the 1920s. And then we see the other thing that I mentioned that Theodore Roosevelt's famous for is the conservation movement. He'll create the Bureau of Reclamation for the development of natural resources. The Sierra Club was part of the progressive movement, which predates Theodore Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt was a member of it in 1892. I'm a member of it. I'm a member of the Sierra Club. I'm not necessarily a great tree hugger, but I generally believe in the cause of conservationism, which is probably another reason that, as I mentioned earlier in the semester, Theodore Roosevelt's my favorite of the presidents. A national park preservation, and then the Country Life Commission in 1908 was designed to, how to say it, add the agricultural sector into the progressive movement, okay, to modernize country living and to highlight country living in the United States. This is the other thing that Theodore Roosevelt is famous for. He was the trust buster. He will go to war with some of the trusts, most notably J.P. Morgan and the Northern Securities Railroad Trust, which was a conglomeration of several railroad companies. He will win. Okay, it will be the first use of the Sherman Antitrust Act. It will also be the first use of the Interstate Commerce Act. And it will result in the dissolution and breakup of the corporate conglomerate. Now, this will continue, and we're not going to get, if we were in an actual course on U.S. economic history, or even if we were in an upper-level economics course, say at the graduate level, we would discuss the conditions under which the national government of the United States undertakes actions to break up a trust as opposed to leaving a trust intact. And so, for example, Roosevelt goes to war with J.P. Morgan and wins and dissolves the Northern Securities Railway Trust. He does not, however, go to war with Andrew Carnegie and U.S. Steel, which was a much larger conglomerate. Now, there's reasons for that. Okay, there's reasons for that. It was determined, without getting into the hardcore economics of it, it was determined that it was beneficial for U.S. Steel to remain as a conglomerate, principally because of the high cost of production, and you want to avoid redundancy with too many steel corporations. These are some of the additional reforms under Roosevelt, for which he's famous: the New York Tenement House Law, which standardized improvements to tenement houses in New York, the Hepburn Act, which regulates the railroads, and perhaps most importantly, the creation of the Pure Food and Drug Administration and the Food and Drug Act in 1906, which to this day attempts anyways to maintain quality control. And again, somewhat tangentially, in a class that we used to, I don't know if we still offer it here at Robert Morris. I used to teach it. It was called Business Enterprise and Public Policy. We learned all about the various regulatory agencies, what they do, how they intervene in the market, whether or not they should intervene in the market, what effects they have on the intervention in the market. What we find is that there is a diminishing returns to government regulation. In other words, when you first institute a government regulation such as the Pure Food and Drug Act, it has the greatest effect in the first 10 years, meaning that you improve quality and reduce the violations the most in the first 10 years. Thereafter, you have a gradual and degenerative reduction of benefits for costs. We find this in the 1970s with the Environmental Protection Agency. When they first were instituted, we had a precipitous decrease in pollution levels in water and air. But as time has gone on, they're pumping more and more money into the EPA and getting less and less reduction in pollution. Same thing with Pure Food and Drug Act. At this point, the Pure Food and Drug Administration, or the Food and Drug Administration, per dollar spent, doesn't get as much of a reduction in bad food, so to speak, as did it when it was originally created. This is just a demonstration of diminishing marginal returns. As I had mentioned earlier, we now have the end of Roosevelt. Why? Well, without getting into it too deeply, what we see with Roosevelt and what we see with the Republican Party in the early 20th century is the same thing we've seen many times before. If we've gone through, for example, U.S. History 1, or if we've done history in high school or anything like that, we see it with the Federalists. Whenever you have an insidious division within a party, it oftentimes spells the end of the party. Example, 1790s. We have a split in the Federalist Party between Hamilton and the High Federalists and Madison and the more mainstream Federalists. As a result, the Federalists lose out. We then have the rise of the Republicans. Okay, well, we have a split with the Republicans. The Republicans come in favoring a limited national government. Jefferson then goes and creates a strong national government. So this divides the Republican Party. Anytime you divide your party, you're asking for trouble. With the Republicans under Theodore Roosevelt, there was an inherent division in the party. It's what got Roosevelt elected. It's what got the Republicans the presidency. They co-opted the progressive movement. In so doing, the Republican Party became chimeric, meaning it had multiple forms to it. One, the conservative. Two, the progressive. Well, Roosevelt's progressivism had gone so far that it alienated the conservative branch of the party. Now, the idea that the conservatives had, and this is one of the ideas in American politics, if you deal with a two-party system, this is the problem with the two-party system, and this kind of borders on American government stuff, but if you have a two-party system, okay, fringe elements in either of the two parties, you don't really have to worry about that much, because who are they going to go to? Who are they going to go to? It's like, for example, the Republican Party today doesn't really have to kowtow, okay, or placate the Tea Party ultra-conservative element of the party, because what option do they have? What, are they going to go vote Democrat? I don't think so. Okay, same idea here. We don't have to worry so much about the conservatives, because who are they going to go vote for? The Democrats? Well, as it works out, they're going to create a kind of an inherent third party. What they're going to do is Roosevelt realizes that he's done. And we also have, you see this two-term tradition. There was a tradition in American politics up to this point that no president had served more than 2 terms in office. The most interesting was, I think, Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland served 2 terms, and he was the only president to serve a split term. He served 1 term, then got voted out, then served another term, and then didn't get reelected. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who we'll study in just a short time, is the only president that actually serves more than 2 terms. Okay, so that's part of why Roosevelt's going to step down, but it's also this division within the party in an attempt to placate the conservative elements of the party and keep them on board and keep them from defecting and either forming their own party or, worse yet, going into the Democratic Party and trying to alter the Democratic Party's platform. He's going to select William Howard Taft, okay, a well-known conservative. So he basically handpicks his successor. The Republican Party puts their support behind him. The progressives very reluctantly do it. The progressives put their support behind Taft because he has the sanctioning of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is the hero of the progressive movement. He's the hero of the Populist Party. Okay? So when he selects Taft as his successor, they believe that that means a continuation of Theodore Roosevelt's progressive policies. The conservatives, for their part, when they see Taft gets Roosevelt's support, they figure that that means a return to traditional conservative Republican values because Taft is known as a conservative. Okay? And so what you have here actually is kind of an example of Schrodinger's cat, right? Whereas if you and for those of you unfamiliar with Schrodinger's cat, you can Google it and look it up. It's really more than anything else, it's a discussion of a process in the scientific process. It's a discussion of epistemology. It's a discussion actually of what effect the observation has on a phenomenon. Okay, if you take a cat and put it in a box and then release poisonous gas into the box, you have no idea at what point in time the cat's dead. Okay, and therefore, as a result of that, until the observation is made, the cat is both alive and dead. Well, similar here. When you select Taft as your successor, at the same point in time, the party's going to be progressive and the party's going to be conservative. This is an inherent contradiction. Okay, it's like Taft's going to be a one-term president. That and the fact that he was the size of a small son. I mean, literally, Taft had his own zip code, and they gave Taft his own zip code in the United States. Literally, when he would walk, when Taft would walk, there would be small bodies, small planetary bodies. Things would lift up off the street and begin to orbit him. Taft really, honestly, weighed about 380 pounds. He was the fattest president, okay? They had to redesign parts of the White House to accommodate him. Okay. Now, what I've been talking about, this conservative versus progressive wing. First blow, the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act, which increases tariffs across the board. This is a victory for the conservative element of the party, which favors manufacturing. It is a defeat for the progressive part of the segment of the party, which favors agriculture, labor, and the more progressive elements of the party. Okay, this is going to be the first of Taft's undoing. Is this playing to the conservative element of the party? We now have the Ballinger Pinchot incident. Okay, and you see the particulars there. Ballinger was a well-known critic of Theodore Roosevelt's conservation movement. Okay, his belief was, and it's a debate that we have today, and Pinchot, of course, was a well-known conservationist. It's the same thing we have today, okay, in the battle between the more conservative elements and what are deemed the tree huggers. Okay, the conservative elements aren't as big on environmental control or conservationism. This is Ballinger. He believes that that you give up a lot of potential economic development when you isolate areas of the country and reserve them as national parks. Okay, environmentalism doesn't necessarily contribute to economic activity. Now, what we know, just kind of as an aside on this Ballinger-Pinchot incident, what we know, and this is something only in the last 20 years of this, and actually Robert Morris University, which is well known for its economics, and I can never say enough good about the economics department here, which is well known for its economics, has been a forerunner in what's referred to as environmental economics or sustainable economics. As it works out, what we've now learned over the last 20 years, to cut to the chase and avoid the real hardcore economics behind it, is that actually over multiple iterations of the game, which is to say over any long period of time, conservationism and concern for environmental factors actually perpetuates economic growth for a longer period of time. You don't get as much economic growth up front, but over time you get more economic growth because you're sustaining your resources. If you go to gain economic growth all at once, you're going to deplete your resources. So it's better to gradually grow and maintain those resources. That's the basic idea of sustainable economics. Okay, and there's a relatively recent trend over the last 20 years or so in the United States. As a result of these and other incidents with the Taft presidency, the party is now divided in two. The Democrats are going to swoop in, and they're going to co-opt the progressive element, the more populist element of the Republican Party, and add populist agendas to their platform. This will be Woodrow Wilson that does it. Okay, Woodrow Wilson will come up to run for the presidency in 1912. As a reaction to Taft, and it's really one of the more interesting elements of American history when we're not really sure what happened here. We don't know whether or not Roosevelt and anointed Taft as his successor because he believed Taft would actually consider his progressive policies, because Taft clearly did not. And as a result of Taft not, or whether or not he did it as a political ploy to try to keep the party together, okay, is the other part of that, okay? We know that Taft did not. Neither did he keep the party together. Roosevelt is going to form his own party, the Bull Moose Party, which will be really the last holdover of the Populist Party of the 1890s, okay? He's going to pull, so what's going to happen is you have two elements in the Republican Party. You have the conservatives and you have the progressives. Well, the progressives are going to split. Part of them are going to join Theodore Roosevelt and the Bull Moose Party and become a third party. The other group is going to be co-opted by the Democratic Party. This leaves the Republicans with an insufficient power base. All they have is this dwindling conservative element, okay, which is still held accountable for the economic catastrophe of the 1890s. Okay, so they're dead in the water as a result of Taft. The Democrats, the Bull Moose Party, for its part, you're talking about, if you were to say 50% Republicans were conservatives, 50% were progressives, well, 25% of those progressives go over to the Bull Moose Party. That's just an insufficient power base. When 25% of them get added to the Democratic Party's power base, it's sufficient for them to win the 1912 election. And this now will usher in the heyday of progressivism. Because even throughout Roosevelt's presidency, there was a conservative element of the party that was effectively acting like inertia. It acted like a drag coefficient on the progressive initiatives of Theodore Roosevelt. To explain that a little more simply, you had two elements. You had the progressive element and the conservative element. Well, Theodore Roosevelt pushed more for the progressive element, but he still had to keep the conservative element of the party on board, and as a result of that, a lot of his initiatives got muted. Okay? Well, with Wilson, that's not going to be the case. You don't have this conservative element. All you have is the progressive element. And so this is going to be the flying high-color day of progressivism, which is going to actually come crashing to a halt after Wilson, for reasons that we'll get into later. Woodrow Wilson's platform was referred to as the New Freedom. You have here, Jeffersonian-like support of the small farmers. He was critical of what he referred to as the triple wall of privilege. This, I think, they talk about in the links that we have from ushistory.org. Tariffs, banks, trust. Big business. That's what he was suspicious of. Progressive initiatives under Wilson, we have numerous initiatives. We have the Underwood-Simmons Act, which reduces tariffs in 1913. We have the formation of the Federal Reserve Act, which is an attempt by the national government, the first attempt by the national government since the National Bank of the 1830s, to gain control over the monetary supply and try to prevent another economic catastrophe like the 1890s. To kind of spoiler alert here, it doesn't really work very well. The Federal Reserve that exists then is not the same animal as the Federal Reserve that exists today. It's the same agency, but there's a lot different. It's going to change dramatically under Franklin Roosevelt. The Clayton Antitrust Act, which clarifies and adds teeth to the Sherman Antitrust Act. Among other things, the Clayton Antitrust Act is going to legalize organized labor. It's going to make strikes legal, exempts labor from prosecution under the Sherman Antitrust. And so so Wilson is labor's golden boy, okay? This is going to be, again, the heyday of labor. These are the additional initiatives under Wilson: the Federal Trade Commission, 1914, Keating-Owen Child Labor Act of 1916, Federal Employees Compensation Act. You can just read them there. Also under Wilson, we will have two constitutional amendments passed. First, the 16th Amendment, which is the answer to a great trivia question. All of the amendments to the U.S. Constitution, with the exception of one amendment, limit the power of the national government. This, the 16th Amendment, is the only amendment that expands the power of the national government. The 17th Amendment, or amendment, without the D there, as I've spelled it there, or misspelled it there, that's all right, it's okay, we know what we mean by that, right? Calls for the direct election of senators, and it was actually passed. at the very end of Taft's administration and then ratified later. This was the first time in U.S. history that senators would be directly elected. Prior to that, they were elected by state governments, for those of